The envelope had been sitting on the kitchen table for 3 days before Willa Crane finally picked it up. Not because she was afraid of what was inside. She knew what was inside. She had written the numbers herself, in the same careful hand she used for farrowing records, for feed conversion logs, for the breeding charts that covered the entire south wall of the old smokehouse. The envelope held a check, one check, the amount of which she had not yet spoken aloud to another living person. She had told the dog. The dog had thumped his tail twice and gone back to sleep under the wood stove. It was the 3rd week of March, 2019, and the mud on the Crane farm in Giles County, Tennessee was the particular deep copper color it only gets when the frost has just broken and the ground has not yet decided what season it belongs to. Willa stood at the kitchen window with her coffee cooling in her hand, looking out past the barn toward the far pasture where 9 Tamworth gilts moved slow and bronze and deliberate through the morning fog like something from a different century. And something about the light that morning, the way it came low and flat off the ridge, made her set the coffee down, pick up the envelope, and hold it to that light. She did not open it. Not yet. She was thinking about a name. A name she had not said out loud in close to 7 years, and the funny thing about names you stop saying is they don't disappear, they just go underground, like taproots, like water finding its way through limestone, and they keep growing in the dark without you. His name was Gerald Moss, and he had been the agricultural loan officer at First Community Bank in Pulaski for 22 years, and one gray Tuesday in January of 2012, he had laughed at Willa Crane across a desk cluttered with coffee rings and manila folders, and what he said, exactly what he said, because she had written it down afterward, in the same farrowing notebook, was, "Registered Tamworths. Honey, that is the deadest business this side of the Cumberland Plateau." She had driven home in the sleet and not cried until she reached the county line. Then she had cried for about 4 minutes, pulled over on the shoulder of Route 31, and then she had put the truck in gear and driven the rest of the way home in the particular silence that comes after a woman decides something final. But that morning, the 3rd week of March, 2019, with the check in the envelope and the gilts in the fog and Gerald Moss's voice still somewhere in the limestone underneath everything, she was not ready to speak the number yet. She would wait until the animals were fed. Some things should be done in the right order. The Crane farm had belonged to her grandmother's people before it belonged to anyone named Crane. 41 acres on the eastern slope of the ridge, hemmed in by a creek on the south side and a property dispute on the north that had been ongoing since 1974 and showed no sign of resolution. The house was built in 1891 and had been added on to twice, badly, so that the kitchen sat at a slightly different angle from the rest of the structure, and in winter you could feel the cold air moving through the gap at the baseboards like something alive and unsatisfied. The barn was older than the house by a generation at least, with hand-hewn beams black with age and a smell of old hay and iron and manure that Willa had been breathing since before she could walk. She had grown up there. Left for 8 years, Cookville, a degree in animal science, a marriage that lasted 4 years and ended without particular drama, just the slow mutual recognition that 2 people had wanted different lives. No children. A cat that had died the same week the divorce was finalized, which she had always taken as a kind of editorial comment from the universe. She had come back to Giles County in 2003 when her father's knees went bad, meaning to stay 6 months and help with the spring calving, and she had never left again. Her father died in 2008. Her mother had preceded him by 7 years. The farm passed to Willa the way things pass in families where there was never really any doubt, not through a grand gesture or a declared intention, but through the simple accumulation of presents. She was the one who stayed. In the beginning, the farm ran commercial hogs. Yorkshire crosses, mostly. The kind of operation that made quiet, consistent money when the markets cooperated and lost quiet, consistent money when they didn't, which was roughly half the time. Willa ran it the way her father had run it, which was the way his father had run it before him, by muscle and schedule and the deep conservatism of people who know that one bad year can erase 10 good ones. But she had been reading. She had always been reading. Animal science journals, old extension service pamphlets from the 1940s that she found in the smokehouse wrapped in newspaper, breed histories, the proceedings of heritage hog associations she had started attending in 2006, driving 4 hours each way to Nashville and sitting in the back of conference rooms smelling of chain hotel carpet and stale coffee, taking notes in the same kind of composition notebook she had used in school. The Tamworth was what caught her first in the pages of an old USDA report from 1919 that she found tucked inside a broken canning jar in the barn loft. There was a photograph, blurry, taken at some county fair, a sow so long and deep-ribbed and flame-colored that she looked like the land itself had given birth to something. The report described the Tamworth as the oldest and most pure of the British breeds. Exceptional foragers. Hardy in harsh weather. Incomparable in flavor, the fat marbled through muscle in a way that commercial breeding had spent 60 years specifically selecting against, chasing lean carcass weights for an industrial market that valued uniformity over taste. The report noted that their numbers had been declining since the Second World War and used the word critical in a way that made Willa sit down on a hay bale and read the page 3 times. By 2009 she had spent 14 months researching bloodlines. She had found a breeder in Kentucky, a woman named Darlene Pickett outside of Harrodsburg, who kept a small registered herd with documented lineage going back to an import from Staffordshire, England in 1962. She had driven out there on a Wednesday in October, when the oaks along the Harrodsburg Pike were burning orange and gold, and walked Darlene Pickett's pastures for 2 hours without speaking much at all. The sows moved like amber water. The boar, Darlene called him Copperhead, though his registered name was Pickett's burnished King too, stood at the fence and regarded her with the kind of calm intelligence that some animals have and most don't, and Willa had put both hands on the top rail and looked at him for a long time. She drove home and wrote a number in her notebook. The number was what she calculated it would cost to start a small registered breeding operation, purchase of 2 gilts and access to proven genetics, fencing upgrades to the south pasture, the annual dues for the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy Registry, veterinary establishment of a health protocol. The number was $17,000, which in 2009, for a farm carrying a mortgage and breaking close to even on commercial hogs, was approximately $17,000 more than she had. So she had gone to the bank. Gerald Moss had a photograph of a base on the wall behind his desk, mounted and lacquered, with a small brass plate beneath it that said Pickwick Lake, 2001. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who knew what he knew, and what he knew was that specialty livestock was a hobby, not a business, and heritage breeds were the kind of thing people with money from somewhere else liked to play at, not the kind of thing a woman with a 41-acre operation and a serviceable credit history built a future on. Registered Tamworths. He had leaned back in his chair. Honey, that is the deadest business this side of the Cumberland Plateau. He had offered her a small operating line of credit at an interest rate that assumed she was a moderate risk and a modest earner. She had thanked him, folded the papers, put them in her truck, driven to the county line, and pulled over. 4 minutes. Then she put the truck in gear. She called Darlene Pickett that same evening, standing at the kitchen window with the phone cord stretched as far as it would go, looking out at the barn. She explained the situation. She explained what she wanted to do and why, speaking in the careful, factual way she spoke when she was most serious about something. No decoration, no persuasion, just the architecture of the plan laid out plain. Darlene Pickett was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, and Willa would write this down too, because she wrote down the things that mattered, I was waiting for someone like you to call. What Darlene proposed was not charity. Darlene had been keeping the picket line for 31 years and she was 64 years old and her hands had started giving her trouble in the joints that made the daily work harder than it used to be. She was not looking to sell the operation. She was looking to extend it. What she offered was 2 proven gilts from her best producing sow, daughters of a line that traced back through Pickett's burnished King II to stock that had been carefully documented since 1981, in exchange for a partnership agreement. Darlene would retain registration rights to the line. Willa would pay a modest annual fee, provide quarterly health and production records, and send 3 animals per year to Darlene at her cost for 3 years. After that, full co-registry of the Crane farm line under a new designation within the Pickett bloodwork. The Gilts arrived in February 2010 on a cold morning when the fields were white and the truck Darlene sent was an old blue Ford that coughed exhaust. Willa had the south pasture ready. New fencing, a second water line run from the barn well, a farrowing area partitioned inside the old smokehouse with new lumber that still smelled of pine resin. She had stacked enough hay for a winter and a half. She had read every piece of literature she could find on Tamworth management in the previous 4 months, which was not as much literature as she would have liked, which was itself a kind of sign of the problem. The Gilts came down the trailer ramp and stood for a moment at the top of the slope looking at the pasture, and something about the way they held their long heads up, testing the cold air with those wide-set eyes the color of new copper pennies, made Willa's chest do something she had no word for. She called them Prudence and Clara, after her grandmother and her grandmother's sister, which felt right. Some names carry forward better than others. And then the neighbors started talking. Giles County is not a cruel place. But it is a place with opinions, and the opinions move through the phone lines and the feed store and the parking lot of the Piggly Wiggly on Main Street in Pulaski with a speed and thoroughness that would be impressive if it weren't, quite often, exhausting. The talk was not malicious. The talk was the particular tone of people who are certain they know better than you do and are genuinely puzzled by your failure to recognize this. Tommy Reardon, who farmed 300 acres of row crops to the west and kept a small herd of commercial durocs on the side, stopped at her gate one afternoon in April 2010. He leaned on the top rail with his cap pushed back and looked at Prudence and Clara moving through the south pasture with the particular liquid-jointed ease that Tamworths have, rooting along the fence line, their copper-bristled backs catching the afternoon sun. "What exactly are you planning to do with those?" He was genuinely curious. The question had no edge in it. She told him. Registered breeding stock. Heritage breed market. Restaurant and specialty buyers for the meat animals. The conservation registry certification that was increasingly what serious buyers were looking for when they couldn't get it from the commodity market. He nodded slowly. "I heard they don't finish as fast as a commercial hog." "They don't. So your feed cost per pound of gain is higher." "It is." He looked at the Gilts for another moment. "Your break-even must be scary." She almost smiled. "It's educational." He drove off in a cloud of goodwill and skepticism, and she went back to work. But he told other people, which was inevitable, and the other people told other people, and by summer of 2010 there was a gentle, thoroughly documented consensus in the county that Willa Crane had gone a little bit odd since her daddy died and was doing something impractical with fancy pigs that would probably come to nothing, bless her heart. The county extension agent, a man named Phil Decker who had an office in the agricultural building in Pulaski and who genuinely believed he was helpful, came out in September 2010 to check on a soil sample she had submitted and stayed to look at the Tamworths for 45 minutes. He had a lot of questions. Most of them were versions of the same question: wasn't she worried? Wasn't she worried about the slow growth rate? Wasn't she worried about the limited market? Wasn't she worried about the gene pool? The registered Tamworth population nationally was very small, and small gene pools had their problems, as he was sure she knew. He said the last thing with the air of a man sharing information he was confident she had not already spent 4 years researching. She walked him back to his truck with the same careful courtesy she gave everyone. He drove away and she stood in the gate for a moment, looking at the pasture, listening to the sound of the Gilts moving through the grass. The afternoon light was just starting to slant, and Prudence was standing at the water trough with one ear forward and one ear back, which was just how she always stood, and the whole scene was so quietly itself, so indifferent to Phil Decker and his questions and Gerald Moss's base photograph and every opinion moving through every phone line in the county, that something in Willa's chest that had been braced since February of the previous year finally let go just a little. She went inside and wrote in the notebook, September 14, 2010. Second Extension Service visit. All questions answered. Both Gilts cycling regularly. Breeding to begin November per Darlene's protocol. The first farrowings came in March 2011. Prudence produced 7 piglets. Clara produced 9. 3 of the piglets from Clara's litter were exceptional, long-bodied, deep in the ham, with the brick-red coat that is the truest marker of the breed at its best, and when Darlene Pickett drove down from Harrodsburg to see them, she stood at the farrowing pen in the old smokehouse with her bad hands in her jacket pockets and looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked at Willa. Then she looked at the notebook on the nail by the door, which by now was the 3rd in the series, dense with observations in Willa's careful hand, every temperature, every birth weight, every nursing interval, every anomaly, every moment of particular grace or difficulty. "You're going to do this," Darlene said. She was not asking. The first year was hard in the way that first years are hard, the gap between the math that works in a notebook and the math that works in the real world, where a piglet gets trampled and a fence fails, and the specialty restaurant in Nashville that had expressed enthusiastic interest in locally sourced heritage pork called back 3 months later to say they had gone a different direction. Sorry. The commercial hog side of the operation still ran, and that money covered the feed bills, but only barely, and some months Willa found herself doing arithmetic at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night that did not come out to anything comfortable. She kept a list on a notepad near the phone: restaurants, specialty butchers, farmers markets, direct-to-consumer contacts, and she worked it methodically. She drove samples to Nashville. She drove samples to Chattanooga. She went to a heritage food conference in Knoxville in 2012 and talked to chefs who were just beginning to understand what the word provenance meant in relation to pork, who could taste the difference between a Tamworth raised on pasture for a full year and a commodity hog finished in a confinement barn in 90 days, and whose eyes did a particular thing when they tasted it: a slight widening, a pause, a look around at whoever was nearby as if to confirm that other people were tasting the same thing. But the certified registered breeding side, the part that Willa understood, even then, was the real engine, the thing with the longest runway and the highest ceiling, was still years away from paying out at the numbers she had projected. The registry certification process was rigorous and slow. The American Livestock Breeds Conservancy had standards that required multiple generations of documented performance data before a line could carry the full designation she was working toward. And the market for registered breeding stock specifically, not just heritage pork to eat, but certified Tamworth genetics to breed from, to carry the line forward into other operations, that market was thin and scattered and required a reputation that could only be built one transaction at a time, one phone call at a time, one person telling another person what Crane Farms animals were like. That reputation began in 2013 with a phone call from a man named Robert Vasquez in Georgia. He had found her through the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy directory, which listed only her name and a phone number and the word Tennessee. He was establishing a small heritage operation in Gordon County, 50 acres, good pasture, serious intent, wife who had grown up on a farm and knew her way around livestock. He had been reading about Tamworths for 2 years. He had visited 3 other operations and had not found what he was looking for. He described what he was looking for in careful terms, and as he described it, Willa recognized it as a description of exactly what she had spent 3 years building. He drove up in October. He spent 4 hours on the farm. He walked the pastures, looked at the farrowing records. By now there were 6 notebooks, organized by year on the shelf above the smokehouse door, asked about the Pickett bloodline and its specific documented characteristics, and looked at the animals with the kind of attention that serious people give to serious things. He bought 2 gilts and a boar at weaning age. He paid $750 per animal, which was not the number Willa wanted, but it was the number the market was at, and it was real money from a real person, and what mattered more than the money was that Robert Vasquez called back in 6 months and said the gilts had settled on first service and were in excellent condition and asked whether she had anything else coming. That was how it started. Not with a single grand moment, but with the small recurring fact of people calling back. Of people who had bought once, buying again. Of people mentioning her name to other people. Of the registry records that she submitted with meticulous regularity to the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy accumulating, year by year, into a documented history that was more thorough and more consistently maintained than almost anything else in the registered Tamworth world at that time. By 2014 she had stopped running commercial hogs entirely. The commitment was complete and it was irreversible, and she did not record any particular dramatic feeling about it in the notebook. Just, March 2014. Final commercial animals delivered. South and West pastures now fully converted. Breeding inventory at 14 registered animals plus current farrowing. But she did, that evening, sit at the kitchen table for a while with the coffee cooling in her hand and think about Gerald Moss and his base photograph, and then she thought about Prudence and Clara moving through the snow in February 2010 with their heads raised and their ears catching the cold air, and then she went to bed. There was a period, 2015 into 2016, that she did not like to look back on too directly. The physical work of the farm had always been hard, and she was managing it alone, which meant the hard work was entirely hers, including the things that broke and the animals that didn't thrive, and the January morning when the water line to the smokehouse burst at 3 in the morning and she spent 4 hours in the cold with a headlamp and a pipe wrench before she got it jury-rigged well enough to get through until daylight. She was 47 years old. Her knees, which had always been fine, began occasionally to remind her that they were 47 years old too. Darlene Pickett's hands got worse that year. Darlene called in November 2015 to say she was beginning to think about dispersing her herd, and the conversation had a weight to it that Willa recognized as the particular weight of things you have been expecting without being ready for. They talked for a long time. What they decided, by the end of that call, changed the character of what Crane Farm was going to become. Darlene would disperse gradually, over 2 years. The breeding animals she considered the core of the picket line, 7 animals, the best she had, would come to Willa at a price that was below market and above symbolic, which Darlene said was how you kept a thing from being either a transaction or a gift, because a thing that is a transaction leaves and a thing that is a gift can't be taken seriously, and what she was doing was neither. She was continuing something. She was asking Willa to carry it. Willa wrote that down, she was asking me to carry it. Those 7 animals arrived in August 2016 on another hot morning, the fields bleached pale by a dry summer, the creek running low. Willa had spent 3 months preparing, extended the east pasture, upgraded the fencing again, added a second farrowing section to the smokehouse, built a new shade structure out of oak lumber from the ridge. She had also, in those 3 months, submitted the paperwork that completed the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy's full certification designation for the Crane Farm line, a process she had been building toward for 6 years, submitting documentation in installments as the record accumulated, and which was granted in June 2016 with a letter that she kept in the same box as her grandmother's baptismal certificate and her father's discharge papers from Korea. The letter was not long. It confirmed that the Crane Farm Tamworth line had met all requirements for full heritage breed certification under the Conservancy's criteria. It noted that the depth of the documented records